This is TWiT.
And now, speaking of time flying by, it's time. And we have a little more time for you this week.
I really love that because I went overboard for this particular conversation.
Oh, good. We're going to talk bourbon. Now, this is a name, a well-known name.
It's one of the names, the names. Yeah. And it's one of the reasons I did it. The Sapphire Falls here has a lovely whiskey collection at the bar. It's nominally a rum bar, but they do have some good whiskey. So we did take a taste of the Weller 12, and it reminded me we've never talked about. We've sort of discussed Weller adjacent to a bunch of other bourbons because they are all intertwined. But William LaRue Weller, or W.L. Weller, is one of the definitive names in American bourbon. So the Weller family immigrates from Germany in the 1740s to Maryland, actually, and so they are farmers and millers, and they end up in the Revolutionary War. That war ends, of course, in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, and a few years later, as Kentucky's becoming a state, they actually move. So Kentucky becomes a state in 1792, and David Weller and family move to Kentucky in 1794. They buy a big parcel of land in Bardstown, which is one of the famous whiskey areas. And by 1800, they are distilling whiskey. They're making corn-based bourbon. Now, they're not the first. Famously, another whiskey I've ever talked about, Evan Williams, is the first to distill in 1783 in Louisville. So David Weller passed away in 1807, and his son Samuel Weller takes over the family business. He marries Phoebe LaRue, which is where the LaRue name comes from. This is her. Phoebe's father actually founded LaRue County in Kentucky. So this is important families of Kentucky together. So, and William is born in 1825, but he doesn't immediately jump into the family business. Instead, he starts working in the whiskey trade in Louisville in the 1840s. And this is at a time when everything's bought by barrel and there's sort of quality issues and all the things that go on with that. He gets out of the business temporarily when he joins the Louisville Brigade and fights the Mexican War in 1847. And I think that really affected him. There's a lot of stories about more soldiers died in the Mexican War of food poisoning from bad canning and food quality than died in combat. Ugh. And so when he returns in 1849, he and his brother Charles form William LaRue Weller and Brother in Louisville to do wholesaling and bottling of whiskey by buying from other distillers. They don't manufacture their own whiskey at all. Their biggest suppliers are the Steisel brothers in Louisville, which have Stitzel brothers in Louisville, who have a big distillery. They're one of the oldest, and also the Old Joe Distillery in Anderson County. Their catchphrase was "honest whiskey at an honest price." And there's a story that at that time, they encouraged some of these distilleries to make wheated bourbon instead of rye bourbon. Right? Bourbon is always at least 51% corn. It typically had 5 to 10% barley because that provides the amylase, so you don't make methanol and cause people to go blind. And then there'd be a flavor green in between the two, and that was normally rye. But apocryphally, that Weller encouraged using wheat instead of rye, making a less spicy, sort of smoother bourbon. The evidence is very thin, and there's pushback on it today, but most people just don't care, really, because today, they are making wheated bourbon. There's no choice about it. So W.L. marries Sarah Pence in 1850. They'll have 7 children over the next 16 years. A couple of years later, his parents die a typhoid epidemic. In fact, he takes in his younger brother John as if he was a son. And then during the Civil War, some of his sons fight in the war. They try to stay neutral, Charles and William. They sell whiskey to both sides, which makes them lots of money. But ultimately, in the process of collecting a bunch of that money in Tennessee, his brother Charles is killed in a robbery. And that's so that by 1876, the war has now been over for 10 years. It's now W.L. Weller and Son. By 1887, it's registered as William L. Weller and Sons, because he did have 4 sons. And they're still not doing any of their own distilling. They are they're producing different kinds of whiskey, some very famous names, many of which they acquired, like Mammoth Cave and Cabin Still and LaRue Malt and Old W. Weller. They're also big. They're not only big on that branding, they'll start making etched shot glasses in the late 1800s. These are very collectible if you can find any of them. They're rare, but it was a unique trait to the Weller distribution service. Importantly, for the history part of this, in 1893, WL hires a guy named Julian Van Winkle as a salesman who will, yes, later be known as
Pappy?
Pappy.
They hired Pappy.
They hired Pappy as a salesman. In 1896, William retires, leaving the business to his sons. He moves to Ocala, Florida, and he dies in 1899, which is a pretty common consequence for Florida, really. In 1903, the Weller sons end up selling the entire business to Van Winkle and his another salesman named Alex Farnsley, but they do make a deal to keep the Weller name as part. They continue to manufacture the Weller distillery. Van Winkle is smart enough to recognize that they really need to lock in a relationship with a distiller, so he works with the Stitzel family, a guy named Jacob Stitzel, to acquire a majority stake in the Stitzel plant, although the Stitzel stay involved. So that by 1920, Van Winkle is the president of W.L. Weller and the secretary-treasurer of Stitzel, and Jacob Stitzel is the president of the distillery and secretary-treasurer of W.L. Weller. So they're pretty tightly intertwined for two separate entities. Of course, 1920 is the beginning of Prohibition, and Stitzel has managed to get one of the medicinal whiskey licenses. So they're able to continue producing, and the brand known as Mammoth Cave was available in pharmacies if you had a prescription. There was only 6 distilleries during Prohibition that were allowed to produce, and this is one of them. That, of course, ends in 1933, and as soon as it ends, Stitzel and Weller actually merge as a single entity and then go about building a new distillery. So in 1935, the Stitzel-Weller distillery is built. This is when they are now fully producing their own whiskeys, and they only make wheated bourbons. The number one brand in that at that time was called Old Fitzgerald. These are famous names that people hear quite often. In fact, the distillery was generally referred to as the Old Fitzgerald Distillery. Alex Farnsley passed away in 1941. Arthur Stitzel's gone in 1947. Pappy himself passed away in 1965, although the operations passed to his son, Julian Van Winkle. Now, by 1972, the whiskey business is very tough, and so a larger conglomerate of food companies and beverage companies called Norton Simon buys Stitzel-Weller. They do rename this distillery to Old Fitzgerald, and Julian Van Winkle makes a deal to keep the Van Winkle name for himself, because they are making Old Rip Van Winkle back then. They'd actually been making it since 1919, and so he has rights of first refusal for any barrels of the old batch from before it was sold in 1972, and he keeps making Old Rip Van Winkle that way. His son joins the company in 1977, Julian Van Winkle, who's still alive today. And as the Old Fitzgerald distillery falls on hard times in 1981, he moves the remaining barrels from the original distillery to different storage locations, initially to the Old Hoffman distillery in Lawrenceburg, although that won't last for very long. In 1984, the Distillers Company buys the Old Fitzgerald distillery from Norton Simon, and Norton Simon exits the industry. And in 1986, Guinness buys Distillers Corporation, which was also struggling. And this is the same entity that in 97 will become Diageo. But before that happens, Distillers Corporation actually closes down the Old Fitzgerald distillery, but they don't want to end the brand. Now, at this point, there's been no Wellers involved in the business for years, right? Once Pappy took it over, the Wellers ended the business, but there was still a Weller whiskey being made. And so even though that Old Fitzgerald distillery is closed, they moved production for the Weller whiskey over to Burnham Distillery, which is then owned by Heavens Hill. And Van Winkle also moves his production there as well. In 1999, it's bought by Heavens Hill, and they disperse the brands again. So Heavens Hill starts making Rebel Yell, Cabin Still, and Old Fitzgerald, although that later on Rebel Yell will move on to Luxco. But the WL brand is sold to a distillery called the Ancient Age Distillery. And that's going to be a breaking point here. And in 2014, the Old Fitzgerald distillery will be reopened by Diageo, who will change the name back to Stitzel-Weller. Now, what the heck is the Ancient Age Distillery, you ask? Well, this is in a region that at that time, the first distillery built in that area, they built on that location was in 1858. It was called the Swigert Distillery, and it was built in an area called Leestown, which today is known as Frankfurt. That distillery got built, and as soon as it was built, the company was out of money, so it got sold a couple of times, and by 1869, it is owned by Colonel Edmund Hayes Taylor Jr., a.k.a. E.H. Taylor, another very famous whiskey brand.
Oh, yeah.
And he renames the distillery the Old Fire Copper Distillery, or OFC. And Taylor owns it for about 8-9 years till he goes broke. And then George T. Stagg buys the OFC.
Another name.
Stunned at the list of names
it's
here
amazing.
following this thing.
I'm going to move you over to the right because the names are on the page.
Yes.
It's all Buffalo Trace owned now, yeah?
Well, this is what the name ultimately becomes. And it's Stagg that hires a guy named Albert Baton Blanton in 1897.
Holy cow.
Joined as a teenager, but by 1921 is the president of the company. And when Stagg passes away in 1894, in 1904, they rename the distillery the George T. Stagg Distillery. And then, of course, during the Prohibition, this is also one of the 6 distilleries that was on the medicinal whiskey list, so they stayed in operation. Although during that time, the distillery was acquired by a group called Schenley, which actually owned the Joseph S. Finch Distillery in Schenley, Pennsylvania. That's where the name comes from. And they actually make a whiskey called Ancient Age, and so later renamed the distillery to Ancient Age. Although in that time span, around 1949, they hire another guy named Elmer T. Lee, yet another famous distillery name. It operates as the Ancient Age Distillery from 1969 until 1999. And in that time, another group called the Sazerac Company acquires it. And then 1999, that's when they rename it Buffalo Trace.
Amazing. And
then they already owned the Wellers, but they, in 2002, went to Julian Van Winkle III and convinced him to move to Buffalo Trace as well. And I've toured this distillery. It is the Sazerac facility, or Buffalo Trace Distillery, is absolutely enormous. It's a massive thing. It makes a ton of different brands, and you've just heard all the names, right?
Yeah.
Buffalo Trace, W.L. Weller, Eagle Rare, E.H. Taylor, Elmer T. Lee, Blanton's, Pappy, all come from the same set of stills. For a long time, they ran on just one enormous 40-foot tall column still from the 1930s, although in 2022, they built a second one, and they produce 60,000 gallons a day. They have dozens of warehouses. They store over 1 million barrels.
So is there any difference between these brands? Yes, there must be.
I'm glad you asked that, because it's a very important point. We've actually talked about this before, and we've talked about some of these other whiskeys, because the Buffalo Trace facility operates essentially on 3 mash bills. They name them creatively 1, 2, and 3. The first one is a predominantly corn with less than 10% rye, and that's Buffalo Trace, E.H. Taylor, and Eagle Rare. The number 2 has 12 to 15% rye, and that's Elmer T. Lee and Blanton's. And the number 3 mash bill is 12 to 15% wheat, and that's W.H. Weller and Pappy Van Winkle. And Pappy is notorious for being extraordinarily expensive. It's because in their original productions back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and even in the 1980s, because there was no distillery per se, they were literally using old barrels and assembling them, and they were very rare and very pricey. But now they're produced at scale, but they're still extraordinarily expensive. But the mash bill difference between Pappy Van Winkle and W.H. Weller are tiny.
Interesting.
And so really, we talk about, if you want to try Pappy, just get some Weller.
Oh my God!
It's
I've
readily
spent so
available.
much on Pappy. It's so depressing.
Now, the particular whiskey that I drank at the time, that I drank the other night, and the one that I highly recommend, is the Weller 12, which is a little harder to come by, and it's not inexpensive for an American bourbon. It's $75 from a regular retail like Bevmo. It's a lot to spend for an American bourbon. But let me tell you, it's a heck of a lot cheaper than the Pappy at 12, if you can find one, which you probably can't find. And it's beautiful, like just a phenomenal. You don't need any ice. You don't need a thing. This is the closest thing you get to that sort of Dalmar-esque, like space side, super smooth, except it's still mostly corn, but it is that red winter wheat that they use that gives it its nature of just being a smooth drinking whiskey. But yeah, this is quite a rabbit hole to follow down. Like, the name Weller involves a person that got out of the whiskey business in 1900, but that name continues on just through a lot of different hands that have maintained this idea that wheat should be in bourbon.
Interesting. Wow. What a story. This is great. I love this.
It's a fun ride to pull together. It took a lot of sources.
Yeah.
I had to read a lot of different documents to link all these things together.
Yeah.
And believe me, I simplified this. It's more complicated than that.
Well, but I've learned something because, I mean, I never owned a bottle of Pappy, but, on a special occasion, I would buy a drink.
Even people who think they haven't.
Yeah.
This is part of the problem.
But I'm going to get some Weller because it's good. You should always have a good bourbon available. Because
I totally agree. And by the way, like that whole list coming out of Frankfurt, the Elmer T, the Blantons, any one of those are lovely bourbons.
I like the little horses on the Blanton.
Yes. And it's really a challenge to collect them all. But we did when we chatted about Blanton back in the day, we talked about all this.
I know I have
a friend who collected them all, but someone just told me, they said, you can go online and actually
you can just
buy the tops.
You can just buy them,
Yeah. Anyway, great ride. And in between me writing this up and actually broadcasting it, a friend dropped off a little bottle.
Look at a little baby.
It's a cute Sutter Mill. So
is that going to be next week, maybe?
Yeah, I just sort of singled you next week's whiskey, which is out of Missouri
cute.
again. My friends from Missouri feeding me rare whiskey. So,
I've learned something.
We'll be talking about that.
Yeah,
well,
Buffalo Trace.
I took you on the Weller ride.
Wow. So of all of these names, if you really, it sounds like the Weller's the one that you probably should get, not the Blanton.
The Weller's the
good.
sneaky one. Blanton's great, but it's still a rye whiskey, fundamentally. And like I said, all of the Eagles Rare is lovely too. We've talked about it before. None of these are bad whiskeys, right?
Right.
But I consider the regular Buffalo Trace is more of a well whiskey. This is the thing you make you make an old fashioned from and so forth.
Right.
But
if you want a sipping bourbon, sounds like I should have a bottle of Weller.
Weller is a great choice. Elmer, also a great choice. Blanton's for sure.
And the Weller 12, not the full proof or the special reserve.
All of those are nice. I think the Weller 12 strikes a real important line.
I'm not a big drinker, so but I do have friends who, when they come over, I like to pour.
You want to serve them something special? I think you've done a good job with a Weller 12.
Yeah, good.